Yep, thank you. Before I get going, I want to give due credit to my colleague, Mr. Tuomas Nummelin, who has made a considerable contribution to the study I'm about to talk about. I'm first going to explain the theoretical background to our application, and then describe what we actually did, and lastly present the tentative results of our work. At Metla, we have an ongoing research project into what customers of woodworking companies need and what they want from wood products. We have decided to include housing, even though it's quite a complex area of consumer research. And the reason for this is that the Finnish forest sector is undergoing quite significant change at the moment, from paper and pulp towards wood products. And then if we knew what aspects of housing matter to consumers, that could create good business opportunities for timber construction. We decided to use a theoretical approach called means and chain theory and develop a new method to get these means and networks from consumers. Means and chain theory is one approach to consumer studies, and the basic idea is that consumers don't just choose products because of the concrete attributes. The example I have here is not actually wood related, it's about snack products. And in this case, the flavored chip and strong taste are the concrete attributes. But according to the means and chain theory, consumers don't choose the product because of these. They choose them because they think that these will lead to consequences and values that matter to them, i.e. they will eat less, they don't get fat, they have better figure, and this in turn leads to a concrete value that they want to achieve. They want to have a better self-esteem. So this, generally the means and chains have been uncovered by using laddering interviews, which are basically just a way of making it easier for consumers to think about why they prefer certain aspects of products. And these have generally been applied in consumer products. It's, for example, quite good for doing comparisons of cross-cultural differences. The previous applications using laddering have faced some difficulties, and we wanted to address this with our new method. One of the most important problems is that it is quite difficult for consumers to discuss their preferences in a linear manner. It's difficult to think, like, why do I want this wooden product to be light color? What does it achieve for me? Then there's challenges in interpreting data and grouping different variables together. And some of the studies that have focused on housing and have used this theoretical approach had their own challenges. A study done in Sweden and Germany by Schauerte was studying multi-story timber constructions, and the main problem with that was that the survey was extremely complex, and that resulted in a very low response rates. Another study, which was done in Finland, and which focused more on the residential environment, was relying quite a lot on the interpretations by researchers, which we thought that caused too much subjectivity in the results. So we used these as an inspiration for a new method, which is a mind map tool. The idea behind the mind map was to have an easy-to-use tool which would be helpful in modeling complex issues in a visual manner. And we thought the visual nature of the tool would make it particularly easy to make the connections between the levels of abstraction. We wanted the levels of abstraction here mean between the concrete attributes, the consequences, and the values. And lastly, we thought that this would also make it easier because there would be less need for the researchers to interpret the answers, because we would get the network straight from the respondents. In practice, we had a default map, which had each respondent have 4 to 10 variables drawn from a set of 34. in a random manner. And these 34 were mainly based on previous studies on housing, but we added a couple that were more related to timber construction, such as wood as a construction material. And then the respondents were asked to think about what was important to them in apartments when they're choosing an apartment. What do they look for and why? The application was placed on our institute's website, and we made some changes based on user feedback on the application throughout the process. And the respondents were mainly directed there through a campaign on a Finnish housing website. This is what the tool looked like in practice. So here you have the default mind map with the variables that have been selected on this map, the instructions, and the background questionnaire. And the background questionnaire was designed so that you had to click on complete here before that window would close. Our data was quite small, but you have to keep in mind that the population of Finland is 5 million, so this is larger proportion than would be the case in, for example, in India. And because of this, the results that I'm going to present are rather tentative. The proportion of valid responses, which we classified as those that were in which there were some changes made to the default map, they varied slightly according to age and educational level, and gender didn't have a role. These are our respondents. As you can see, it's very heavily skewed towards females, and somewhat skewed towards those with higher education or who are younger than the average of Finnish population. In terms of the quality of the mind maps, we were quite happy with the quality, and many of the requirements were quite practical, even though it's possible to detect a slight emphasis on the needs of children and family. And this is what our results look like combined, when we combine all the mind maps that we got. The red balls are concrete attributes, the green ones are consequences, and the blue ones are values. And as you can see, this is rather complex, so we decided to analyze it in smaller parts with different tools. This shows those variables which appeared on the maps more than once. The red ones, again, are attributes, and as you probably are not able to read the text, but I can say that, as you can see, there's majority of these are attributes, which would suggest that it's easier to think about more concrete properties of apartments. And most of these are also quite practical. At the top, there's big kitchen, number of rooms, and utility room. These describe the variables in default settings. The blue ones are how many times they appeared, red one, how many times they were deleted, and the green one is how many times they were theoretically expected to appear on the map. I think the most interesting here are those which appeared quite often and were not removed by any respondents, which include the number of rooms, good neighborhood, size, functionality of layout, good location, and closeness of services. And these are obviously things that are quite generally recognized to be important in apartments. The second analysis we wanted to do on the maps was to analyze the complexity, because we would basically argue that a more complex map is more representative of the mind of the respondent. And to highlight why we think this, I'm going to show you a couple of the maps that we got from the respondents. This, as you can see, is rather simple. It only has a couple of variables, and they're only connected directly to the apartment. This is more complex and has interconnections between the variables. This is even more complex and has, as you can see, it has more links between different variables. And this is one of the most complex maps that we got. And you can see that it has a huge range of variables. There's several variables at the level of consequence or value, and there's a lot of links between the variables. And what we would argue is that this map is the most representative of the mind of the respondent, and those previous maps are only partially representative. Now, in terms of how we analyze the complexity, we started with degree counts, which are a generally used indicator of network properties. And they can be used as a proxy for the importance of a particular node in a network. And the ones that come at the top of the degree counts here are also variables which are generally recognized to be important in housing, such as location and comfortable home. The one that's a little bit surprising is public transport, which is quite high up, which could be caused by the fact that we had a bit younger respondents who might not have their own car yet. The second analysis was to search for clusters using mathematical methods, more specifically the algorithm of Blondel. And the clustering was done on the basis of those variables that the respondents had in common. And this shows the results of the clustering. Again, the print is quite small and it's also in Finnish, so I'm going to highlight the important things. The main advantage of the mathematical clustering when compared to clustering done by researchers is that here we look at the links that the respondents have made, and this can reveal some more surprising connections that the researchers might not notice. On this result, you can see this one here. That's quite easy to understand. That's well-maintained surroundings and an own caretaker. So that would be something that the researchers might find out. But this one here, it's a bit stranger. It has easy to care for surfaces, healthy apartment, and year of construction, which is a rather more bizarre combination of variables. Now, to compare with previous studies on housing in Finland, previous studies have shown that good neighborhood functionality of layout and a healthy, well-soundproofed apartment are quite important. And findings of our study are reasonably in line with this result, with perhaps a slightly more emphasis on practical attributes. One interesting thing is that the ecological values seem to have gained a little bit in importance, which might have good implications for timber construction. I say might because, at least in Finland, there's slight ambiguity about the use of wood in construction. It's not necessarily seen as the most ecological construction material. Then, to go on to the implications for timber construction, the variables that we thought would be relevant for timber construction, which were wood as a building material, facade material, frame material, and good soundproofing, they didn't really appear on the maps that often. But what our findings would suggest is that facade material is more important than frame material, and wood might have a positive image among the Finnish consumers, and also that good soundproofing might not be that important. I bring up the good soundproofing because, at least in Finland, it's something that's often discussed in reference to timber construction, as in that the multi-story houses with timber flooring and timber parts might not have as good soundproofing as those made out of concrete and steel. I thought you would like to also see what sort of things are connected to wood as a building material. In our data, we only have one mind map which actually had wood as a building material and where it was connected to other variables. But as you can see, it does have quite positive connections. There's the closeness of nature, big multifunctional yard, peaceful living environment, So these would suggest that wood might have a positive image, at least for some consumers. Because this was experimental applications, we do have some suggested improvements that we want to work on in the future. One of the general problems of means and chains is hierarchical thinking, and we thought the visual nature of our tool would make it easier. But that didn't work out completely. So we still need to work on that. Connected with that, I don't think all the respondents were familiar with the concept of a mind map. Then we had some more practical problems with the usability, the graphical user interface, and the instructions, and we received suggestions on how to improve those, for example, by including a demonstration map. But on a positive note, the majority of the respondents were able to do what we asked them to do. They deleted the variables that were not important, and they added new ones, and they changed them to a different level. So in that respect, this actually works pretty well. Now on to conclusions. We do think the mind map is an interesting method, but it needs further development. And the mathematical tools like the degree count and clustering, those would be especially useful if the data sets are larger. And tentatively, we can say that Finnish consumers value a comfortable, well-located home with a good layout. But the ecological values and child-friendliness are emerging issues that might be something that timber construction could address. And as a last recommendation for timber construction, we could say that it's advisable to focus on good architecture and high-quality buildings and not get too hung up on the barriers such as frame material and soundproofing, because they might not be quite that important to consumers as we sometimes make them out to be. Thank you.